Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the War Report. And I know that I have fallen into a bit of a schedule inadvertently of putting out an episode every other week. I try not to go any longer than 2 weeks, but sometimes scheduling can get a bit dicey. Some behind the scenes stuff, trying to figure out some stuff with when I can actually record and being able to put this together. So I do apologize if every other week is a bit infrequent. I want to try to do it more often because it does keep things more concise. It gives me more time to talk about minor stories that might get breezed over, as I'm sure they will tonight. And I also try to keep these solo episodes no longer than an hour and a half. I know that I do go over that sometimes, but a monologue is not the same as a conversation. And I understand that, and that one guy talking only has so much to say. So I will try to keep it limited to avoid repeating myself or just going around in circles because I do it, we all do it when it's just us up here alone. But without further ado, I do want to just keep you guys briefed on the basics because there's been quite a bit that's happened in the past couple weeks. So, for our frontline update, we will first go to Velikaya Novoselka, and you can see the arrows right there are the directions of Russian advance, whereas the little highlight mark is indicating Russian gains. So there's fighting in the northernmost arrow is Velesoye, Shevchenko, which there's a lot of those. Admittedly, you actually can look a little bit uh, eastward on the map. There's a Shevchenko that's fully under Russian control, but there's Shevchenko um, that is west of Velika and Novoselka. And then Novopil, which is just south of Zelenie Polye, which is where the Russians have captured just within the past 2 days here. I'm recording the night of May 29th, just to put in context, so this happened around the 27th to 28th. Moving on from that, we have Seversk, and there is fighting right now near Bemivka, which is the northern arrow, and Perez Noye, which is the southern arrow, with Russian advances and Russian gains in Verkhen Kamenskoye. Moving a little north to Sumy, which is the newest front of the war post Kursk offensive, there has been clashes in the villages of Vladimirovka, which is the first arrow you can see right here. And then the second arrow you can see right here is for uh, Yunakovka village, with the village of Konstantinivka along the Russian-Ukrainian border in Sumy. There's also a lot of Konstantinivka, so just to clarify with that, has fallen under the control of Russian forces within the past 2 days as of the day of recording, which was, just to confirm, recording today on May 29th. Moving on to the Konstantinovka front, which is probably a little more familiar to all of you to avoid confusion. There is fighting in the villages of Poltavka, Yablunivka, Zoya, Petrovka, and just north of Toretsk. And the Russians have advanced near Staraya Nikolaevka, which is the southernmost highlighted point on the map, and also they've advanced near Ozaria Nivka, which is the northern highlight on the map. Moving on from there, we can go on to the Kupiansk front, and right now there is fighting in the direction of Vigolivka, Mala, Shepkivka, Kondrashovka, and Radkovka, with the Russians advancing in Stroyevka, which is the highlighted mark right there next to the border of Russia and Ukraine. And finally, one of the more active fronts in the recent weeks of the war is the Chasov Yar front. So, moving on to that, we have clashes near Orikovko, Vasilovka, and Russian advances in Grigorovka, which you can See the highlighted marks right there. And also in Chasiv Yar proper, you can see the highlighted mark on the more southern point of this map. The Russians are continuing to push into the outskirts and close to Nikolaevka and really starting to. I mean, this Chasiv Yar is almost entirely under Russian control, but really finishing the encirclement. And this was one of the bigger Ukrainian strongholds. This has been a hotly contested settlement since last summer, since before the Kursk offensive. This was one of the ones that was constantly on the headlines, constantly being updated in terms of it. And it was a slog. It was a slog for the Russians. I'm not going to estimate the amount of casualties, but also heavy losses for the Ukrainians as well. They dedicated a lot of manpower to keeping the city for as long as they did, which does reflect their overall strategy, I guess you could say, on the front. Whether you want to go to Bakhmut, if you want to think about, I mean, it's been about 2 years since Bakhmut, um, Avdiivka, Ugledar, any of these real major fortress city battles. And I wouldn't put Chasiv Yar on the same caliber as any of those, but it was a significant city. It did dominate the headlines, and it looks like that is coming to a close, which means we're seeing with that and Pokrovsk really starting to come into focus soon, which that was a quieter front these past couple weeks, not as much development there. But as the war really shifts to Pokrovsk, which I think is going to be the decisive battle of this phase of the war, the Donbass phase of the war, we can see a clearer vision of the future once that is resolved. But beyond the immediate news on the front line, the focus these past couple weeks, aside from negotiations, has been on drone and missile strikes. The barrages that have been traded back and forth between Russia and Ukraine. And there's been hundreds, if not thousands, of drone waves heading into Russia from really since the beginning of the month. It just has been an almost nonstop barrage to the point where when Putin was overflying the Kursk region in his helicopter, or being taken in his helicopter, they buzzed that. And you can choose to believe whether or not that was intentional. I don't think it would have been. Not that I would put it past the Ukrainians, but the Russian skies, I don't want to dramatize the situation. I don't want to make it sound worse than it is. But it is becoming more and more dangerous because these drones are hitting industrial targets, they're hitting military targets. Some of them have even been known to hit civilian targets as well, in which case the Russians are starting to respond probably more seriously than they have since the start of the war regarding this, because the Ukrainian drone program is, yes, much more advanced than it used to be. They've really worked this down. I don't want to say to an art form. I don't think that really treats the situation with the gravity it deserves. But they mastered, I guess you could say, the science behind it. That they know how to launch these. I guess you could call them terror waves. That being the Ukrainians, and while most of them do end up getting intercepted, the Russians do have quite advanced air defenses. These attacks are intensifying. Some of them they are taking small single-engine aircraft and rigging them up with unmanned controls and flying them into different targets. You have to recall, going back to some of these drone and, strikes and some of these long-range missile strikes from Ukraine, which I'll get into the Taurus missiles in just a little bit here, that some of these were trying to hit, say, early warning systems for their nuclear program, their nuclear weapons program, which to me suggests, and perhaps I'm reading too much into this, and this is not an original take at all, but to me suggests that they are simply a battering ram for something bigger to come, for anticipation of some larger campaign or some larger war further down the road. Like we hear the European Union and NATO go on and on and on about war with Russia in the next decade, blah, 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 blah. We've all heard this a million times. And while I do think a lot of that is an excuse to prop up the authority of the current bureaucrats of the current NATO establishment, there has to be some kernel of truth. There has to be some sort of preparations that they are making. It can't just all be propaganda and posturing in order to, say, improve their personal positions. But this has led to two primary responses from the Russians. One is a bit more abstract, despite, yes, it actually is a program they are embarking on and not just an idea being floated around. And that is the buffer zone. The question of how far will this buffer zone stretch. You could believe Medvedev when he posts the map of it pushing all the way up to the Polish border, which, considering the source, it probably is just a provocative statement. It is probably just red meat to the base, as it were. But maybe with a kernel of truth. But there is a more serious concerted effort. What we are seeing on the Sumy front right now, with many of the advances there, is that the Russians are pushing in for a buffer zone there. Because that was one of the primary staging grounds they used to attack Kursk. Not only by ground, but also by air as well. And what may be more substantial, depending on who you ask, is that on their strikes in response to these Ukrainian drone waves, the Russians did blow up the Antonov factory in Kiev. They did hit it. I'm not sure if it was complete destruction, but they did strike the factory, which has been used for making drones primarily. It's one of the few real functional industrial centers left in Ukraine, and they've been using it to crank drones off the assembly line. And the Russians, after over 3 years of war, finally took out the factory. Now, one could speculate why they waited this long. If I had to guess, it was some sort of fear of escalation, or even that they wanted to have some sort of goodwill with the Ukrainians for the negotiating table. Perhaps it's a combination of the two. I don't think the Russians were ever incapable of striking this. I think we've seen with Russian air, missile, and drone technology, this target would have been easy pickings. They've hit precise targets across Kiev before. Now, that's not to say there has not been any collateral damage, because there has. But I ask you once again, and not to justify any civilian casualties, none of it's okay. It is all unacceptable, especially if it's unintentionally. But I will say once again, between the strikes on both sides, and this, of course, is not accounting for 2014 and 2022, which is a much deeper question. But since the outbreak of the 2022 war, civilian casualties in this war have been around 10,000. As compared to, say, Gaza. Do you even want to try to guess how many civilian casualties there's been in the Israel-Palestine war? I mean, what the lowball estimates are. I know that some people try to say, oh, it's only 20,000, whatever. But no, I don't believe that. Not at all. And that's not even counting the number of people who have been displaced by this war. But once you consider those numbers, of course, the Russian-Ukrainian war, we're talking on the scale of millions. But they are not the same situation. However, I will say it is a testament to, I know this is often repeated in these circles, Russian restraint, and also their ability to conduct more precise strikes. And I'll get into Trump's reactions about this, the whole runaround with diplomacy, whatever, because there's a lot to cover in terms of the diplomatic side of everything that's been happening these past couple weeks here, because it's been a clown show, to say the least. And not that I was ever too optimistic, but it does look less and less optimistic as time goes on. And I fear that we could be even further entrenched in this by the time this is all said and done than had we just stayed with the current course, even under, say, somebody like Biden. And now, I'm not saying that that's going to happen, but there's always that very real fear with the snakes Trump surrounds himself with. In this case, I'm thinking particularly Rubio and Kellogg, and how much of a negative influence they've probably had on him in this entire negotiation process. But I will put that to the side for now and talk about the negotiations that never were in Istanbul, or as some people like to call it, Sauerkraut, or even if you want to go back further, perhaps even Constantinople. Many names for the city. But officially, the city known as Istanbul, the second largest city in Turkey, and one might argue its cultural capital, its most significant city, is continues to be the forum in which these negotiations are carried out. And Zelensky went to Ankara during these negotiations and met with Erdogan, did not bother making an appearance, despite him saying, oh, Putin's not going to show up. And admittedly, Putin didn't show up, and he never made any commitment that he was going to show up. So the onus was more on Zelensky, who insisted he was going to show up. But you had Medinsky and Umarov and the delegations of the Russian and Ukrainian sides, respectively, really not making any headway. However, the talks are still technically on, which compared to, say, 3 years ago when the Ukrainians were executing their own negotiators, I guess you could call this progress, but how much of this is just stalling for time at this point? But what is more interesting in all of these talks is the dynamic between the United States and Russia, and particularly Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin, because that is what this comes down to. The Ukrainians are a proxy party in this war. They have, I don't want to say they have no agency of themselves, but after they committed to going along with this project, they put their fate entirely in the hands of the Americans, of the American State Department, of the Pentagon, and they hitch their wagon to them in every sense. And if it goes off the cliff, it goes off the cliff. That's really what it is. But moving on to Trump and Putin's phone call, which took place on the 18th, and I'll just briefly read out what the White House had put out in regard to that. And this comes from Levitt, who is the current press secretary. Today, President Trump and President Putin spoke about the need for peace and a ceasefire in the Ukraine war. Both leaders agreed that the conflict needs to end with lasting peace. They both also stressed the need for improved bilateral relations between the U.S. and Russia. The blood and treasure of both Ukraine and Russia have been spending this war would have been better spent on the needs of their people, blah, blah, blah. This conflict would have never started and should have been ended long ago with sincere and good faith peace efforts. The leaders agree that the movement to peace begins with an energy and infrastructure ceasefire, which you'll recall that was probably 6 weeks ago at this point, as well as technical negotiations on implementation of a maritime ceasefire in the Black Sea, full ceasefire and permanent ceasefire. These negotiations begin immediately in the Middle East. The leaders spoke broadly about the Middle East as a region and potential cooperation to prevent future conflict. They further discussed the need to stop proliferation of strategic weapons and will engage with others to ensure the broadest possible application. The two leaders shared the view that Iran should never be in a position to destroy Israel. So you can see that, of course, the White House, the Trump administration, is putting their spin on it. And while I'm sure Putin said something to that effect, I doubt it was as, say, strong worded as what an American message would be. But to continue, the two leaders agreed that a future with an improved bilateral relationship between the United States and Russia has huge upsides. This includes enormous economic deals and geopolitical stability when peace has been achieved. Pretty boilerplate, I admit. But the key takeaways from the Russian side, and this is coming from Ushakov, who is a presidential aide, is that they spoke for 125 minutes. It was their third phone call since Trump took office. Ukraine-related topics were discussed by Putin and Trump in a similar detail with interesting nuances. Putin and Trump did not discuss any timeframes for a ceasefire. Putin and Trump addressed each other by name. It was a sincere, trust-based conversation with a lot of digression. Putin and Trump discussed another prisoner swap between the U.S. and Russia in the 9-for-9 format. Putin and Trump discussed bilateral relations and spoke in favor of normalization, discussed Ukrainian settlement problems in detail. Putin lauded Trump and his administration for its positive role in Kiev's return to the negotiating table. Trump said that he sees Russia as one of his country's key trade and economic partners after the Ukraine conflict is settled. Putin and Trump agreed to continue dialogue on all matters, including Ukraine. Uh, they've not yet named a date and venue for their meeting, and Kremlin aide Ushakov especially noted the call's duration, with neither Putin nor Trump wanting to end their conversation. How sweet, how wholesome. Now, what I actually think happened is I do think it was probably a very conciliatory phone call. If for no other reason than that Trump is a very personable individual, and that even if he is with somebody who, say, hates him, and I don't think that Putin has that strong of negative feelings against Trump. I do think he sees the situation as it is, and maybe is a little bit more too conciliatory for his own good. But even for somebody who doesn't particularly like or even dislikes Trump, he's very personable, and in that kind of format on a phone call, I could see where, yeah, it would look sincere, it would look friendly between the two. And of course, the joke was it was 2 hours, so they, I don't know, maybe they got up to the Mongol sacking of Kiev in terms of the history lecture. I don't know. Putin can go on for a while. By the way, we all remember the Tucker Carlson interview. But in all seriousness, it's a start. I'm not going to say it was anything groundbreaking. I'm not going to say I'm particularly optimistic, but the bar is so low at this point that even semi regular dialogue between the US and Russia looks like a world of improvement compared to what it was under the Biden administration. And there is the possibility this all does blow up in our face and this all does fall flat. But at least there was a semblance of an effort. Even if that was just for the sake of appearance, even if that was just for optics, there was a semblance of an effort. And after his phone call with Putin, Trump spoke to several European leaders, uh, and that included, of course, Zelensky. At the time, it would have been Merz, Maloney, Alexander Stubb in Finland, Macron, and Ursula, and they all participated in a call with Trump after his phone call with Putin. And the Europeans came out, the big coalition of the shilling came out and said, yes, it was a very productive conversation, and a lot was accomplished, and we all feel warm and fuzzy and good about it. There was a so-called anonymous source, and who knows how true this is, that said Zelensky walked away not feeling too good about the conversation, saying that was, quote, bad, and that Trump said during the call he was unwilling to impose sanctions on Russia because believed there was a chance to resolve the Ukraine conflict, and said that the Russians are ready for dialogue and hostilities and were not stalling on the issue. Now, the Financial Times, citing a source, said that European leaders were stunned by Trump's description of his talks with Putin on May 19th. I'm sorry, May 19th was the date of the talks, which lasted over 2 hours. They were particularly struck by his reluctance to impose sanctions on Russia because, of course, we are at the 17th sanctions package coming out of the European Union. 17th time is the charm. And it's just business as usual. Every time they promise a harsher sanctions package, nothing happens. And they just get egg on their face and they double down on the same failed policies that will continue to fail. And Europe will continue to destroy itself over the same failed policies. And I've said from the beginning, since this negotiation process started, since Trump got elected, that while I had little faith in Trump's negotiations to bring out any sort of long lasting solution to the conflict, the Europeans had their off ramp right there. They could have co signed fully onto the Trump negotiation plan instead of this 1 foot in, 1 foot out, because of course Brussels is going to have to take their marching orders from Washington, whether they like it or not. And I will say, for the millionth time, I'm not saying this in a triumphalist sense. That is simply the reality of the situation between the relationship of the United States and the European nations. They will take their marching orders. But they'll drag their heels and they'll form the coalition of the willing. And in fact, Trump's actually a little okay with that. He said, "You can do whatever you want in Ukraine. In fact, I prefer it. You guys handle the situation so I can wash my hands of it and focus on other matters." But the Europeans did have an out. They could have fully co-signed onto this. They could have said, "We're completely with Trump, regardless of anything else. Sure, we might have our disagreements, our trade issues, whatever, but we are dedicating to getting a long-lasting peace in Ukraine," which would have given some much needed relief to the European Union. Even if it was a gradual repeal of sanctions, even if it was just some caveats, say, like the ones they give to Hungary and Slovakia, also, I believe, when it comes to some energy deals, it could have been smoothed over, could have allowed the Europeans to regain their footing. But it has been doubling down on support for Ukraine since. But there has been some progress on negotiation between Russia and Ukraine. If you consider a 1,000 for 1,000 prisoner exchange progress, that, unlike previous prisoner exchanges, did not include anyone from Azov, Idar, or any similar divisions of the Ukrainian military that hold, let's just say, for the sake of the platform we're on, more radical ideas. And this deal effectively wiped out Ukraine's bargaining power when it came to Russian prisoners to the point where the Ukrainian newspaper Strana reported that Ukrainian negotiators were giving offers to Ukrainian citizens who were detained for quote unquote pro Russian activity, anyone from businessmen, people who took pictures and videos of missile strikes or military objects, car arsonists that mainly targeted the TCC, and also quote unquote hardcore pro Russians and people who were simply framed. And it does look like they were offering a lot of these people up, and you have to recall that during the Kursk operation and their other border incursions into Russia, they would take civilian prisoners. They would take them hostage, and they would use them for their prisoner exchanges, where the Russians are willing to accept a lot of these people. We've seen this time and time again, but it does let the Ukrainians dodge around the issue and not participate completely honestly in the prisoner exchange, which, to the understanding of everyone, should be prisoners of war, soldiers, military types, like the Russians mostly gave up. But I do have to say, it is interesting because we've seen before the Russians were willing to give up Azov prisoners. They were willing to release some pretty controversial figures and people who had done some very evil things. There's no other word for it. When just from 2014 onward, during the opening phases of the Donbass, were in awesome parts of Ukraine outside of the Donbass as well. But otherwise, the negotiations have been rocky, and I don't think there's really any other way to put that. And that starts with Trump, who was eager to, like I said, be the facilitator behind these negotiations, did propose the Vatican and had the Vatican come out with the new Pope, Pope Leo 14th, I believe. I apologize if I got that wrong, but who, as one would expect, came out and wanted to present himself as a mediator in the ongoing conflicts, which I don't doubt his sincerity, but I think the political power of the Vatican in 2025 compared to, say, what it once was when it did have the ability to mediate wars and negotiate ceasefires, we're a long way from there. And what some of the Russian officials had said, which only makes sense, is that it's not an appropriate form because you want us to go to a microstate in the middle of a NATO country and also two predominantly Orthodox Christian nations. And yeah, you can talk about the issue with the Ukrainian Church. We have a number of times on this program, but two ostensibly Orthodox Christian nations, the Vatican is not going to be the form in which this kind of conflict can be solved. So the Russians were pretty adamant that it's saying Turkey, but what I wonder, and maybe there's detail I'm missing here, is I think Kazakhstan is the elephant in the room when it comes to hosting these talks. Because Belarus, while it has tried to host these talks before, would be written off as, say, too biased towards the Russians. And admittedly, yes, they did help with the staging of the special military operation. That is true. Uh, there's not really a NATO country aside from Turkey, maybe Hungary, but even that's a little bit of a stretch. Or Slovakia, once again, a little bit of a stretch, that would be able to facilitate these talks. But you have Kazakhstan, which is a country on good terms with Russia, as far as I understand, has decent relationship with the Ukrainians, and also a good relationship with the United States. And one has to wonder at that point, why are they not the forum for a peace summit? They hosted the peace summits for Syria. Now I know that Syria ended up with Assad falling and Jolani taking power, but that's not the point. The point is that Kazakhstan, I think, is probably the closest thing you can get to a neutral country that has any sort of connection to the conflict. And we saw previously China was one of the proposed countries, India. Both are BRICS countries, they'd be written off. And I'm sure the Ukrainians would find some reason not to have it in Kazakhstan, because even though Turkey is, let's just say, amenable to hosting Russian diplomats, it's a NATO country. It's the flip flopping country. It's the country that will side with the U.S. when it's convenient, and also has an interest in this war really ending in a status quo, if not, let's just say, a disadvantageous position to the Russians, because they have a vested interest in not having the Russians too strong in the Black Sea. The more divided it is, the better for them, because they have one of the largest coastlines in the Black Sea, especially compared to their fellow NATO countries of Bulgaria and Romania when it comes to Black Sea coast. So Turkey is, yes, a reasonable host for these forums, but I think the only reason they're in Turkey is because the Ukrainians wouldn't agree otherwise. I don't think the Ukrainians certainly wouldn't agree to, say, Belarus, China, India, whatever, and I don't think they'd agree to Kazakhstan at this point, unless the United States would be. Now they were willing to agree to the Vatican, and we saw how that turned out. It's a non-starter. It doesn't make any sense. Uh, and I do think a lot of that comes down to, well, to the fact that the Vatican is, as a political institution, as something that is technically a state, and I know that the status of Vatican City is a little nebulous, simply is not in a position, or nor does it have really the political capital in order to host these kind of talks, even if they are backed by the U.S. and the West, in which case we would see the biases seep through. So as far as actually getting the Ukrainians to the table, it looks like Turkey is probably the only option. Unless they got really desperate, then they might agree to Kazakhstan. But I think if we were being honest about a country that would actually be able to properly host these talks, it would be Kazakhstan. But that's something that's been on my mind for a while. It's something I haven't really had a chance to bring up, but something I wanted to address nonetheless. Now, we did get Trump lashing out, and I'm not going to go through his entire Truth Social rant about Putin having gone crazy. This isn't the man I know anymore, sounding like a spurned lover. But he did lash out, and of course, he didn't have kind words for Zelensky either. And some view this, perhaps too optimistically, as an out that Trump's trying to take, where both sides are unreasonable. I've done all I can. We need to just leave the situation. And look, I tried, but you can't reason with unreasonable parties. And some people say it's rhetorically setting up for that. But it goes beyond that, because Trump is mulling over further sanctions as a result, particularly of the Kiev strikes. This was what really got under his skin, the Kiev strikes against particularly the Antonov factory, as well as the question of arms sales to Europe, which has been happening before, but it goes back to the idea, which is something I've discussed a few times, that American support for Ukraine is going to be laundered through the European countries. The Americans might officially distance themselves, but they're going to be selling arms to the French, the British, the Germans, whoever, who are in turn going to supply them to Ukraine, and that the Americans are going to become a third party supplier. And I have no doubt that this has happened already. Even though the Americans have given an immense amount of direct aid, I would imagine much of the aid coming from Europe was probably originally purchased, maybe at a discount, to the Europeans, just in order to make it look a little more diversified when it came to sources of their aid. And that's not including all the stuff that probably exists off the books. But assuming Trump isn't just trying to remove himself from the situation, which I don't believe he had ample opportunity to do so and has not taken it yet. And yes, I understand the situation is a little more complicated than that, but point being is there were a number of outs he could have taken with this. But assuming it's not that, I do think Trump fails to realize, particularly because of the influence of people around him, and I would put the blame on Kellogg and Rubio, and possibly some of his staff out of the Pentagon. Maybe not Hegseth, because Hegseth does seem a little removed from the whole Russia-Ukraine conflict, but there's probably some underlings of the Pentagon who feed him the information where he probably does believe the information about high Russian casualties. He himself quoted the 600,000, 700,000 figure about Russian forces, although he did concede the Ukrainians had probably lost more during those same interviews, those same press conferences, those same uh, media grillings, as it were. And he probably also believes the Russian economy is in a much tighter position than it actually is, that they are desperate for some sort of economic relief, and that sanction relief would mean the world to them. But neither of those are true. And I know that going back to Trump's first term, he was rather reluctant to read or pay attention to his daily briefings from the intelligence agencies. And some fear that may have carried over into his current administration with somebody like Gabbard, who you could say a lot about. There's criticism to be had. You could say that she's possibly sold out on a number of issues. As far as anyone who could be director of national intelligence, there's worse options, admittedly, and she and her team are probably putting together, at least on the Ukraine issue, a bit more honest reports. But if those are being filtered through Kellogg and Rubio, or if Trump is being dismissive with those, then that could be a real problem. If he is believing these ridiculous numbers that came from the last administration when it came to Russia's ability to fight and win this war. And that could explain the pressure we see right now. And Rubio, I think, is the real snake in the room. Not to dismiss Kellogg, not to criticize, not to spare him from criticism. But let's just look at a few things that Rubio has done so far. He knows that they're not going to get sanctions relief, which is one of those things that Trump keeps hammering on. That just it's beyond their capability at a certain point, because that would require the consent of Congress, because they're the ones who impose the sanctions. And that Rubio, being a former senator, rather experienced senator, all things considered, has friends and favors he can call in Congress in order to sabotage that, which he definitely wants to. And Lindsey Graham, who's been in Trump's ear, who's been feeding him all sorts of bad information, subversive nonsense, probably the worst person you could have in Trump's ear on an issue like this. Well, he's buddy buddy with Rubio, and they seem to be on the same page. And that Graham is trying to force through bills to block any sort of sanction relief, or in fact, even imposing new sanctions, and just doing whatever he can in his position in the Senate and Congress to derail talks. And I don't think it's shocking that Rubio still has his neocon priors. He's very strongly connected to those. Maybe he's not as hawkish on some issues. Maybe he's a little bit more ground reality for the simply because he has to be. But he's completely in line with the Atlanticists on this, with the neoconservatives in Washington, with many people in the intelligence agencies, the Pentagon, with much of the European establishment. And we saw what Trump did to Mike Walls over his connection to Israel. And I'm not saying that Rubio has, say, a direct line to Ursula or whatever. I don't think it's that deep, but he is very much in line with, say, the Europeans, which is what gained the ire of, which is how Mike Waltz gained the ire of Trump in the first place. And that's not even getting into the question of SWIFT, which or secondary sanctions, which once again the Europeans and Rubio are exactly on the same page on. And if you want to believe a source quote unquote close to the State Department, Rubio is bringing up sanctions on a daily basis, and he is an advocate of Lindsey Graham's sanctions bill. Uh, and at this point, with the way it looks in Congress, it does have a veto-proof majority. Where if it showed up on Trump's desk, even if he kicked it back to Congress, they would put it right back there, and he would have no recourse. They did this to him in 2018, 2019 over the one of the sanctions packages that he said he signed because it would be pointless. It would just be a waste of everyone's time and effort if they were to kick this back to Congress because it passed something like 99 to like 1. And I think that one was like Rand Paul. This, like I said, that's like 2017, 2018, maybe even 2019. Early Trump and Trump's first term. But Kellogg, I don't trust him. He needs to go. He could be very easily fired. He's simply an envoy for the president. He could be replaced with Witkoff tomorrow and say what you will about Witkoff, but I think particularly on the Russia-Ukraine issue, he's a bit more grounded. I can understand why some people might say he's too biased on the Israel-Palestine issue, despite the fact that he's probably the most neutral voice, and admittedly has a very low bar we've had on the Israel-Palestine issue in a number of years. But Kellogg, compared to Rubio, at least comes off as reasonable. But he's bringing up this 22-point plan, which which says, well, the Russians and the Ukrainians are both going to have to make concessions. So I suppose the principle, if neither side likes it, you must be doing something right, or perhaps if neither side likes it, you're doing something so wrong that you've united polar opposites on it. I don't know. But one interesting statement he did say that I do think is worth mentioning is that Russia's concerns about NATO expansion are legitimate, and that the U.S. is not currently considering Ukraine joining NATO. But being the envoy to the president, he's limited in what he can say publicly because his job is a direct representative of Trump and his administration. So, like I said, his hands are tied regardless of what his opinion might be or what he might want to say, what might sound the best. He has to toe the party line, as it were. But he continues to say, and we're not the only country that thinks so. I can name you four more such countries from the alliance, and join you will need the consent of all 32 members. He's likely referring to Turkey, Hungary, Germany. That might have changed into MERS, or Mertz, as it were, and Slovakia. Those are almost certainly the countries he's referring to. And there's frankly probably more if it really came down to brass tacks. But that is a flimsy promise. And like I said, and I know that Kellogg, being the envoy, isn't exactly speaking for himself, and not that I think his own position would be any better, is that's a promise that can be rescinded at any time. We're not currently considering it, but we could consider it a year down the road, 10 years down the road. It simply does not solve the issue at hand. And the last piece of Ukraine news I'll leave you before getting into some European news is, I don't want to call it a bizarre story, but it's what one would expect given the conduct of the Ukrainians abroad since the start of this war. And that is former Yanukovych advisor Andrei Portnov, who was living in Spain in exile since the Maidan, was assassinated by Ukrainian assets. And he was on Mirotorovets for years. He was considered somebody who wanted to uh, concede too much to the enemy, that being Russia. He was one of those damned peacemakers, as it were. And It was alleged that he had some information he was going to leak on the Maidan government about its extensive corruption, as if we didn't already know about that. I find those claims a bit more dubious. But the Ukrainians have a long reach that they can assassinate somebody living comfortably in Western Europe, even if they are some government exile. What makes you think that they haven't been involved in other sabotage efforts? Especially considering the news that came out of Hungary a few weeks back with the intelligence drones flying over in order to sabotage a parliamentary process for Hungary. These can't be the only two nations they've done this to. If you want to get into the Ryan Ruth question, how deeply was he tied to the Ukrainian government? And if you want to get into Nord Stream, well, I think that we all can concede that, yeah, that was primarily a CIA operation. It wouldn't surprise me if Ukrainian intelligence was right there with them. I know that Ukrainian intelligence agencies are effectively an arm of the CIA these days, but when it comes to the people doing the legwork, it may have very well been Ukrainians at the direction of, say, American intelligence or the American State Department or the Pentagon or whatever. But this is becoming an increasing danger. That's not even getting into the Ukrainian models who tried to set fire to Keir Starmer's residence in the UK. Where as this war does continue to go against Ukraine, because it's not going to go any other way, you are probably going to see more spurned Ukrainians who are either acting independently or with other backers lash out at their quote unquote Western allies. And the best of them, I suppose, will be picked up and turned into intelligence assets to be placed wherever they're needed across the globe by the American Empire, as it were, or by whatever little passion projects the Europeans have created for themselves. But these guys are going to be a dime a dozen. But there's going to be a lot of these guys who are spurned, who are unemployed, who lost their country, and are going to lash out at the people they view as responsible for not helping them enough. But that's not if Chancellor Friedrich Merz doesn't have anything to say about it, because he's taken the bold decision about, I don't know, almost a year after we got it from the Americans, the British, where the Taurus long range missiles are now at the disposal of the Ukrainians. And this is the real game changer. This is the wonder weapon that is going to win the war, we can guarantee you. And with that, on a more serious note, the Ukrainians are going to continue to use these. They're going to use them in the same way they use their drones. They're going to launch these terror campaign attacks. And the Russians said that, yeah, we fully reserve the right to retaliate against these, as we did with the the Storm Shadows and the American long range missiles and the HIMARS and everything else. And that I'm sure this one was just more of a provocative statement than anything, because it did come from, I think it was actually Lavrov, who has been a bit more on the provocative side himself lately. That, oh, we might even have to strike back at Berlin if that's the case, which obviously is not going to happen. But the Germans are entrenching themselves further in this war, and much like the Americans, the British, the Polish, they are liable for them and their military personnel who are operating unofficially or even officially in Ukraine to start taking more casualties. Because even when you look at the mercenaries and the volunteers and the NATO personnel there, while the Germans have been a presence, they've not been as much a presence as the Americans, the British, the French, or even, say, the Polish. Or even the Georgians at that point. But you'll notice the Georgian supply really petered out after, I guess, what you could call the regime change in Georgia after they returned to sanity in some senses. But Merz isn't the only European leader who is trying to really define himself in this much more uncertain, and dare I even say multipolar world. Because Macron, as always, has been making his own maneuvers. Now, it's more or less confirmed by Pavel Durov in a day late, dollar short sort of sense that French intelligence wanted him to meddle in the Romanian elections. And with this recent round of Romanian elections, I think a lot of people put far too much stock in this because Georgescu was barred. He was not going to come back in. He did throw his support behind Simeon. Now, Simeon was completely on board with the Atlanticist project, completely on board with NATO. He was just a bit more socially conservative, a bit more culturally nationalistic, maybe more in line with, say, Trump's vision of NATO, which or Trump's effective vision of NATO, or the American vision of NATO, if you will, where it's just going to be business as usual, but they're also not going to dedicate themselves more to Ukraine more than they have to. Not that he was anti-Ukraine by any means. Simeon was, like I said, more or less party line. I suppose the closest comparison you could make, and it's trite, but it works for a reason. Maloney is really what it would have been. But Nikos Ordan, the former mayor of Bucharest, won the election, and he did so very much so with the blessing of France. And he's France's man in Bucharest, as it seems. And the French do have some cultural pull in Romania, Latin people, Romance language, etc. And with the construction of a new NATO facility, and also proximity to Odessa and the Black Sea, if they were to decide to move the quote unquote peacekeepers in, it's the perfect staging ground for it. And this isn't Macron's only move these past couple weeks. And I'm not just talking about, let's just say, his playful little tussle with his wife, as his PR team had tried to spin it. We're not going to talk about the incident in Vietnam. No, we keep things very above board on this show. But there were French military exercises, or French observers for Canadian military exercises in Quebec. Uh, and I don't know, there's just been a number of very strange posturing on Macron's part where he's trying to become the nuclear umbrella of the European Union. He's aligning himself with the Canadians and the British in order to condemn Netanyahu and to put pressure on Israel as well. Which, oh, don't worry, I'll get into some of the stuff about Israel because that was a bizarre story, all things considered. And a lot of people were very emotionally charged about it, and I think they missed the forest for the trees, as it were, because, like I said, I'll go ahead and get into that in just a little bit here. But Macron is positioning himself in the perceived vacuum of American leadership as that head of Europe, because those shoes have been empty since Merkel. Nobody has really been able to fill those, and it's everything he ever wanted. And while being completely on board with the Atlantis project, he's trying to paint himself as a third way, as a more moderate return to centrist liberalism that the rest of the world can look to, while the Americans descend into populist buffoonery with MAGA, and while Russia and China plot to put us all under some 1984 regime, as he would say. The French can be the enlightened liberals as always, and what a privilege, what a wonderful position to be in for them. And I'm sure Macron is just lapping up every second of it. But this admittedly is very impressive strategic posturing. Now, the problem is, aside from the nukes, the French do not have the guns to back this up. They do not have the military presence to back this up. Even if they wanted to put these peacekeepers in Odessa, if they were to trade blows with the Russians in any real sense, which I don't think it would come to that, it's not a contest. Simply, logistically speaking, it isn't not a contest. Without direct American support, which I'm sure it would come eventually, NATO is not going to be able to fight a war against Russia. You can talk about Friedrich Merz's reindustrialization plan all day, which is going to come with severe austerity measures for the everyday people. And if that's a program they implement too harshly or too rapidly, it is going to backfire. That probably is the straw that would break the camel's back for a lot of European countries, because they'll tolerate migrants because there is a tap. They can increase, decrease the migrant flow when things get too dicey. Even, say, center left liberal governments in places like Denmark will become immigration restrictionists. And you'll get Keir Starmer adopt similar rhetoric. Now, I know he's outside the European Union, but the point still stands. But there's a pressure valve they can adjust when it comes to the immigration question. But if true austerity starts to come, the kind that would be needed to support Mertz's spending in order to rearm Germany for a threat that, well, yeah, a lot of people will sit there and they'll complain about the Russians. They'll talk about how they're the greatest threat. When it comes into the brass tacks, these people do not actually existentially feel threatened by. I don't see how it goes over well. Perhaps I give too much credit to the masses in order to stand up for their own interests, and that maybe the past decade at least has shown that they'll eat anything you put in front of them. They're like goldfish, and they have a 5 second memory. But we'll have to see. I don't think Mertz's rearmament program is even going to get off the ground, frankly. Sure, there's the adjustments they're going to make for that. There's all the budget fiddling, whatever. But I think the project is fundamentally dead on arrival. And that while they might have the guns to back it up, the French do look like a. The French resemble something of a serious pole in this multipolar world, and that they're far more the leaders of the European project at the time, and that they can use that to their advantage. But if it is challenged militarily, they would likely fold like a house of cards. There's really no other way to put it. But to move on to some, I guess, say more interesting stories in a way about Europe, is the arms scandal from Serbia, where it was revealed from Russian intelligence reports something I think we all already knew, is that Serbian arms were being purchased by third parties in order to supply them to Ukraine. And Serbian arms were particularly sought after earlier in the war because it was all Soviet model, that they were going to be able to get these Ukrainian troops who are trained on these Soviet systems up and operating. When it comes to, say, aircraft, which admittedly Serbia doesn't have that big of an air fleet, but particularly when it came to artillery. Artillery was the big thing they kept hammering on. Now, that wasn't the only country to be caught up in this, but you would have the Serbs selling their arms to countries like Bulgaria and Poland, the Czech Republic, even some African countries who, in turn, would end up handing the weapons over to Ukraine. And Vucic, who was in hot water as it was, even though the protests had subsided, came out and said, "Oh, I'm not going to sign any bill from now on. I'm not going to sign any arms sales that may end up in Ukraine," which could really be any arms sales. Now, I suppose you could say that, yes, that would also involve some private contractors. They're not entirely off the hook for this as well, but I think there was fully an understanding of what was going on. That, yeah, Vucic was willing to sell the arms stockpiles to these NATO states, knowing full well that they were going to be transferred to Ukraine, in which case that money probably came from Washington originally. And like I said, I remember stuff about this story from like 2 years ago. There were allegations of this, and hey, I hope that he does put some sort of limitation on arms sales in order to prevent this, because it prolongs the war, even if ever so slightly, gets more Ukrainians killed, deprives Serbia of their arms. Now, I know that they weren't exactly digging into the stockpile, but given some of the situations in the Balkans recently, I wouldn't want to be selling off my arms if I was in Serbia with this new little grand coalition of Croatia, Albania, and Kosovo forming. Uh, Even though you can laugh at it, you can scoff at it, They are they are trying to strangle out Serbia. That's just simply what it is. And even Hungary came to their defense at that point, where Hungary said that they're on Serbia's side, and the ever unstable situation that Bosnia is, that could fall apart in a I won't say any day, but it's a fragile state. And if they're exporting their arms, which they already have a major military advantage over all their immediate neighbors, excluding NATO status, it's simply a foolish move. And like I said, I know Vucic has been waffling over the place he has for a number of years, but I do hope that public backlash does help him to, let's say, make more reasonable decisions that maybe aren't guided by such a short-term mindset. Uh, some funny news out of Europe is that Poland is willing to pay for American troops for 10 years, where they're willing to allocate 250 million USD worth annually through 2035 for the development of U.S. military infrastructure in the country, announced the Polish Defense Minister Kazniak Kamich. Now, the entire appeal of NATO, especially for these quote unquote Central European countries going into it, it was supposed to take some of the burden of defense off them. Now, officially, they're supposed to meet the 2% defense threshold, which Poland, yes, actually does meet. And it was supposed to make the region, quote unquote, more safe and stable, which would encourage investment, both in terms of military and civilian economic development. But they've turned it into a position where Poland is now shelling out for the privilege of American troops. That is how paranoid they are about this conflict spreading over, that they are willing to, what, by the time this is done, is going to be like 2.5 billion over the course of I'm sorry, 2.5 trillion over the course of 10 years if we're talking about 250 million annually. I'm sorry, billion. I misspoke. It's a little late. I slipped up on that, but yeah, 250 million annually is 2.5 billion over the course of 10 years. And yeah, to an American that might sound like a drop in the bucket in terms of spending, but we're talking about a smaller, I don't want to call it poor, but a poorer nation that was supposed to be receiving money for economic development, which was the entire reason it went forward with this whole harebrained scheme of joining the European Union and NATO. And now the empire has come to collect. It's time for the vassals to understand the true arrangement here, as it were. And like I said, I will repeat for the millionth and first time that this is not a triumphalist take on my part. I do not like the arrangement that exists between the United States and Europe. I don't think it benefits the Europeans. I don't think it benefits Americans who aren't rabid Atlanticists. And this is just further entrenching the problem. And other nations may follow suit with that. Uh, but the paranoid isn't just limited to Poland. You already have people in Lithuania evacuating the Suwalki Gap, fearing that they're going to be next, that they don't want to be the victims of a first strike from the Russians. The same paranoid fear mongering that you get out of the Baltic states. Which, speaking of the Baltic states, perfidious Albion is at it again. And that is that the UK, in a joint effort with Poland, had taken control of all children's and youth paramilitary organizations in the Baltic republics. I didn't know the Baltic republics had children's paramilitary organizations. So what? There's a total of 10 children between the three republics. What are we talking about here? The agreement to this effect was signed by the UK Army Cadet Force and the Central Military Recruitment Center of the Republic of Poland, along with Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. One such paramilitary organization is the Jaunsarde, a youth version of the Zemisarde militia. A former member of this group, Nikita Taranov, fought with Azov and was recently eliminated by the Russian army. Uh, I didn't I didn't know this existed. And I know that the British, particularly in the Balkans, do have their networks there, and that the British Navy have been coordinating with the Ukrainians on drone attacks in the Black Sea as well. And despite their decline, when it comes to sowing division and conflict in Europe, the British still have their methods of doing so. They might be a little blunted compared to what they once were, but they exist. Don't be mistaken about that. Even though I don't think this will actually amount to anything, I just wanted to mention it because it is a bit of an absurd story, admittedly. Now I want to, before I move on to some of the Middle Eastern stuff, and like I said, I promise not to make this too long of an episode. I'll wrap it up with some of the Middle Eastern stuff. Is the trade talks between the United States and the European Union, where after contacts between Trump and Ursula von der Leyen, they agreed to a pause on tariffs for further trade negotiation. And this was the threat of the 50% tariff until July 9th. And the Europeans are more or less in position, while they can raise a ruckus, while they can complain and whine and threaten to partner up with China, whatever, they're not in position to accept anything else than what the U.S. presents to them. And that probably is going to be lopsided, probably is going to screw them over in many ways. But especially if they're unwilling to thaw relations with Russia or take it even a step further and solidify the relationship with both Russia and China, then they're going to have to take whatever bum terms the U.S. gives them, which one of the terms that was floated around, and it's been floated around for years, is American LNG. That they were going to import American LNG, which is about 4 times more expensive than the pipeline gas that Europe was getting from Russia, which is only going to continue to rise cost of living on the continent. It's only going to continue to rise cost of doing business on the continent, which leads me to my next story regarding tariffs and the trade disputes of the U.S., is that German automakers are seeking tariff exemptions as the crisis continues. Particularly Volkswagen, Mercedes, and BMW are in their own negotiations with the United States government in order to have tariff relief. And BMW and Mercedes in particular are in extensive talks with Howard Lutnick, who is the Commerce Secretary, while BMW is hoping for their situation to be resolved by early July, by the deadline. And of course, this doesn't apply to the German auto manufacturers who have their plants in the U.S., but the the empire is coming to collect. And as it declines, as the American empire enters into or continues through a state of crisis, it will continue to cannibalize the vassals, it will cannibalize the European economy, it will cannibalize European industry in order to keep itself afloat for ever so longer. Uh, they will drag those manufacturing jobs across the Atlantic if they need to, because that is the stage they're in now. The Europeans are being thrown under the bus in both a military sense if you look at Ukraine and some of the Eastern European states, and an economic sense when you look just across the continent. And this is the final price of being a vassal state to such an empire. But there is an interesting domestic element to these tariff talks, because Trump, in his eternal disputes with the American justice system, with the appellate courts, the district courts, who want to strike down everything he does, is that they declared his tariffs on international trade unconstitutional because they did not pass through Congress. And this includes the 30% tariff on China, the 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico, and the 10% universal tariff on all other countries. But this did not affect the 25% tariff on car, steel, or aluminum, which the auto industry negotiation with Germany, those would fall under. But it does look like through say domestic efforts, there might be some saving grace of the Europeans, but once again, they still don't have that many options. They are still stuck in a more or less impossible position. Eh, Unless they turn to Russia and China, which is simply not going to happen. But as far as the Middle East is concerned, the negotiations with Iran continue in some form, which once again, some progress I suppose is better than no progress. But Iranian Foreign Minister Arachi, who has been the head of the Iranian team of negotiators, insists that enrichment will continue and that regardless, it will continue. And his terms that he's set forward is that they can agree to no nuclear weapons. They have a deal then. But when it comes to no enriched uranium, they simply do not have a deal. And he went on to say he told the Europeans what will happen if they activate the quote unquote snapback clause of the JCPOA, that they will lose their diplomatic contacts with Iran because the Europeans have more or less held to the standards of the now almost dead JCPOA, which, yes, that includes the snapback clauses if the Iranians were found in violation of the agreement. There were certain retaliatory measures that could be taken, blah, 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 blah. But Arachi, speaking on behalf of the Iranian government, is adamant that those should not be activated or else the deals are off. And the Europeans do a modest amount of trade with the Iranians, but particularly with how unstable the energy situation is, that's not a relationship I would imagine Europe would want to jeopardize. Which, once again, they find themselves really bearing the brunt of a lot of these conflicts. And that's not entirely their fault, I'll say. That some of this is just a matter of circumstance and just the way that cards were dealt to them. But the U.S. Iranian negotiations did continue over the past couple weeks, and that these ones did take place in Rome, and they appeared to be stalling out. However, neither side has really called this off. And what it does look like is that both sides are really delaying for time, and that if this does amount to anything, it will just be a repackaged JCPOA that Trump can stamp his name on for the sake of legacy. In which case, we will have wasted close to a decade of the perpetual issues with the Iranians when we could have stuck to the original deal, when we could have left the status quo in place, because it looks like we're going to be returning to that status quo, which admittedly, there are worse things in the world. It certainly beats another protracted Middle Eastern war. But it gets egg on the American face collectively. But once again, there's a massive elephant in the room that is determined to derail these negotiations, and I'm sure you can guess that is Netanyahu. And the rift between Trump and Netanyahu does continue because Trump is absolutely not on board with these strikes. He's saying to the Israelis that no, you're not going to sabotage my big, beautiful peace effort. You're not going to tarnish my legacy. Even though some say this might be a little bit of theater where the U.S. can have some plausible deniability while the Israelis conduct their strike. But I think at this point the divide is a bit too deep when it comes particularly to the personalities of Trump and Netanyahu. I don't think that kind of coordination can exist between the U.S. and Israel now because the overall relationship between the U.S. and Israel, yes, remains the same. But when the two chiefs of state do not get along, or the two heads of government, because Israel technically has a president, whatever. But when the two men in charge, as it were, are not seeing eye to eye, it makes cooperation all the much harder for them. But returning to the Washington Post, to back up some evidence, to give some backup evidence on the Trump Netanyahu rift, is they're citing a source that's saying Trump is putting increased pressure on Israel over its escalation in Gaza, and saying it approaches a point of no return in the war. Trump is telling Israel that the U.S. will abandon Israel if they do not stop the war. Um, Believe what you will. I think that's probably a little bit of an overstatement. Trump's bluster, whatever. But I do think, if for no other reason than his own reputation, he does see the Gaza war as a thorn in his side. But this next report comes from Ynet, which is an Israeli news outlet, so take it with a grain of salt. The Trump administration is concerned that Netanyahu will disrupt nuclear talks with Iran and may even order an attack if a diplomatic agreement is reached. American intelligence is concerned about the possibility that Israel will launch an operation without warning or provide only a warning of several hours that would not leave enough time to pressure Netanyahu to cancel it. Continuing on with some sources from the New York Times, Netanyahu instructed his officials to plan a smaller attack that would not need American assistance, and that U.S. intelligence estimate Israel could prepare to mount an attack on Iran in as little as 7 hours, leaving insufficient time to pressure Netanyahu into canceling. And finally, once again from the New York Times, Trump stated Sunday that something good might emerge from his efforts to restrict Iran's nuclear program in the next 2 days. The disagreement over the most effective approach to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons has resulted in at least one heated telephone conversation between Trump and Netanyahu, along with numerous high-level meetings between American and Israeli officials in recent days. After his April White House visit with Trump, Netanyahu ordered the Israeli national security officials to continue planning for an Iranian strike, including a smaller operation that would not require U.S. assistance. Israel maintains that numerous different plans, ranging from surgical strikes to days of bombing Iranian facilities, including some populated cities. And of course, Netanyahu's press office denies the report and really trying to appeal to Trump, calling the New York Times fake news. In which case, he may be right. Because a lot of this is speculation, a lot of this is sources say, blah, 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 whatever. But one does have to consider, if the Israelis are brazen enough to go through with such strike, even without U.S. approval, we've seen that the Iranians are capable of having countermeasures. We've seen their strikes against Israel before, and some people may have said those are weak, some people may have said those are just symbolic, but they showed they could land their missiles within very close range of their airfields, and within very close range of Dimona nuclear plant, and that they have a formidable drone program of their own. Keep in mind that the Shahed drones we see in Ukraine, that we saw the Russians using in the early days of Ukraine, originated from Iran. And that if Israel wants to throw the first punch in this fight, or throw yet another punch that the Iranians will retaliate to, they may be getting more trouble than they ask for, especially now that the relationship between Israel and the United States seems to be a little on the fritz. Now, I would hope the Iranian leadership would understand, for the sake of just avoiding escalation war altogether, that a major retaliation, if they were to, say, strike the Dimona power plant, there would almost certainly be a U.S. response. That despite Trump and Netanyahu's clash of personalities, in all likelihood, the Americans are still going to come to the military aid of Israel if there's any substantial Iranian attack. And that the situation for U.S.-Israeli relations would have to degrade so much further before we saw a real reluctance to defend Israel. But we can rest assured, at the very least, it doesn't look like Trump is going to give his blessings to these strikes. And I think anything the Israelis carry out on their own would not warrant any sort of significant retaliation. That, like, I don't think the Israelis are going to strike Dimona. I'm sorry, I don't think the Iranians are going to strike Dimona over whatever pea shooter attack the Israelis could put together on their own. But there is another element to these Iran talks that is overlooked. And that is the relationship with China, which increasingly has been via land. Particularly because of how uncertain sea trade has become. We've seen the Americans seize a number of Iranian ships over the past several years, particularly during Trump's first administration. But it looks like the proposed rail corridor we have here has come to fruition. You'll see right here, this is from the 9th of December 2015, from China Daily. But just this past week, a cargo train arrived from Xi'an, China, into the Operan dry port near the Iranian capital of Tehran, and this was on Sunday. And this is the furthest distance that they've done on this rail, and it cuts delivery time down to 15 days versus the 30 to 40 that it took for sea trade. And we're talking about the the vital economic relationships between China and Iran, and particularly when it comes to energy, that you're probably going to get a lot of oil and natural gas moving by train if they don't develop a pipeline at some point, even though there are methods around that. But now the Chinese, and they have before, but even further, the Chinese have a much more vested economic interest in stability in Iran. That's not to say they wouldn't throw the other government or the current government under the bus for another government if they had some sort of guarantees that successor government would continue to cooperate with China. But if the U.S. were to embark on regime change in Iran, of course, the Israel lobby would be a large factor in that. But especially at this point, if this were to still happen, it would be aimed at hedging in China, and it would be aimed at breaking down China's land routes. So the Chinese have a vested interest in making sure this current government stays in power, or some government that is amenable to their interest. But now the American concern there is twofold, because, like I said, despite whatever clashes might happen between Trump and Netanyahu, the American-Israeli relationship is not going to be budged by this unless something severe happens. And number two, if we're to believe that China is the number one rival, if we're to believe the stuff coming out of Trump's Pentagon under Hegseth, then we could be entrenched in the Middle East for a whole new reason this time. But finally, I'll finish up with some news about Israel itself, and I'll give a brief update on Witkoff's current activities when it comes to his negotiations. And he had put forth a proposal for settling the situation in the Gaza Strip that provides an immediate ceasefire for 60 days and a release of 10 hostages. Says once again Ynet, which is another Israeli news source. So, like I said, take it with a pretty major grain of salt. And that during the first week of the ceasefire, Hamas would also hand over the remains of 18 deceased hostages, and in response, Israel must release Palestinian prisoners in accordance to previously approved lists. And that it would also allow for the previously approved humanitarian aid to be delivered via the UN and other international organizations. And this would encompass a 60-day ceasefire talks, which are currently being hammered out. And Netanyahu has said, or at least he said, that he accepts Witkoff's proposal, and that the Hamas leadership is studying it. However, during this whole time, the Israelis are still assassinating Hamas leaders, and you could say, yeah, sure, they're at war. But point being is, if you're trying to get to the negotiating table, if we're to believe the Israelis are acting in good faith with accepting some sort of ceasefire agreement, this behavior is not conducive to that. Even if this is some irredeemable bastard that needs to be taken out, it's about timing. It's about optics. It's about not throwing away your negotiating position over one petty revenge strike, which Israel seems to be incapable of doing. But I suppose the biggest news about Israel this past week was the incident at the Israeli embassy with the two staffers who were assassinated by an American citizen, an American national. This guy was. You can't say this guy was a schizo, because regardless of whether or not you agree with his political positions, the things he said were not the ramblings of schizophrenic. They were somebody who, yes, was ideologically committed. And he did commit an act of violence towards that. And No, of course, the obligatory I do not condone violence in any form, blah, blah, blah. Just to get that out there, just to cover my ass with that. No, I don't condone violence in any form, blah, blah, blah. But a few things were strange to me about this. That is number one, two low level staffers were taken out, neither of which happened to be Jewish themselves. And secondly, this comes literally a day after delegations from 20 nations in Gaza were fired upon by Israelis. And then all of a sudden you have this story, less than 24 hours later, about this action. Now you could write this off to coincidence. You could say that because of how charged the topic is, people have taken to extreme measures regarding their opinions on it, and I can accept that. That there probably are a lot of people who are very heavily ideologically motivated on this, but it doesn't sit right with me when just less than 24 hours before that, you had the Israelis firing on international coalition of diplomats from Europe, Asia, Africa. I think even Canadians were in there. I could be mistaken about that one. And that it completely deflects that story. And that's not getting into the question of when the Israelis struck the Iranian embassy complex in Damascus back last year in 2014. And I do think there's a difference between an individual actor and, like I said, the regular, yes, violence is not okay. This man should not have done this. All the disclaimers you have to put out there. Um, which yes, I do believe. I don't think that stooping down to the level of even just assassinating embassy staff is moral or will solve anything for anyone. Just like I said, just to have that all out there, just to make myself clear. But it's not the same thing as a military doing that to an international coalition investigating a situation on the ground of an active combat zone. And this is only going to get nastier. It doesn't look like so far, because it's been about a week since those attacks, since the attack on the Israeli embassy staffers. Doesn't look like the Israelis have pushed their narrative saying, oh, this was some Iranian linked intelligence asset, which they did try to claim at first. But those claims didn't really stick. And it seems like the entire issue's really been memory hold just a week on. I figured people would be talking about it a bit more. But it has devolved into just bog standard culture war talking points because the guy shockingly was of a very left wing persuasion, and that becomes uh, left versus right and petty daily politics issues in the American consciousness, which I suppose is better than it being the discussion of a false flag. But it's only going to get worse from here. You're going to get organizations on the other side of the issue who also take to violence, and you've already had cases of that. But this could simply be rid of this issue if Trump would just make the phone call and tell Netanyahu he's on his own. I'm not saying Trump needs to take any drastic action, but just Trump or anyone who's president just needs to tell the Israelis they're cut off. Not that we're declaring a state of hostility against them. That simply just tell them you're on your own. And the situation will resolve itself. Much like Ukraine. We just need to place that magic phone call and to say you're on your own. And as far as we're concerned, over here, the situation will resolve itself. And as far as the active parties are involved, there probably will be a little bit more of a stable arrangement than had we tried to oversee both of these. Trump needs to say, oh, I've given it my best shot. We have more important things to focus on. We have our trade negotiations to focus on. We have our domestic issues to focus on, etc., etc. And that we've tried to facilitate peace between all these parties, but they're on their own. That's all that Trump needs to do at this point. And I would say particularly for the Israeli-Palestine conflict, because this does seem like the one that where people are going to be fighting on the streets over it. You'll notice in 3 years of Russia and Ukraine fighting, you haven't had diaspora fights in the middle of the street. And like I said, it's that simple. And I know that people are going to bring up blah, 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 blah. And yes, the deep state's a problem. Yes, the administrative state's a problem. But somebody's just got to pull that plug. Somebody just needs to cut both of them off. And this situation will be resolved. And like I said, I'm probably oversimplifying this. Probably being a bit flippant about this. But it needs to be done. Because if it's not done, this will come back to haunt us for years to come. And this will start to affect normal, everyday American citizens, not just embassy staff, not just um, political ideologues. This is going to start to have blowback on everyday people who, no, should not be caught in the figurative or maybe even literal crossfire of these political disputes. But that is all I had for this week. So we will see you guys next time, and goodbye.